Hey guys, this is Varun Srikanth from Strength System, and welcome to what is the first of hopefully many videos in our mobility series. Now, before we get to the good stuff, I want to give you guys a brief overview of what this is all about. Now, over the years, what we found is that while strength work is great for getting folks stronger, leaner, fitter, it doesn't address everything. We've had people come back to us saying things like, my back feels stiff, my hips get tight, my shoulders just feel restricted. I feel like I need to do more quote unquote mobility work. And that's where this video series hopefully comes in. We want to bridge the gaps left by traditional strength work that we do in the gym. Now, these videos have been informed by the functional range conditioning system. You can look them up online, which I have personally found really helpful as a way to look and work on mobility. Through the videos, I'll be using some technical terms that the FRC system uses. Now don't worry, I'll be walking you guys through exactly what they mean and how to apply them. Final word on equipment. We've made these videos so that they can be followed along with little to no equipment. So all you might really need is a tennis ball, a yoga mat just for your knees and ankles, and maybe a foam roller. Okay, so without further ado, let's get. So the first thing we're going to move on to is the warm-up. And the goal of our warm-up is simple. We want to move every individual joint of the body from the head down to the ankle through the fullest possible range of motion. Now we're going to do this with something called a controlled articular rotation, or CAR. Now a CAR is really simple. My goal when I'm doing a CAR is to simply take that particular joint through its fullest possible range of motion without any other joints really contributing to the movement. Now this will make more sense when I actually demonstrate, but I want you guys to really keep this in mind. Now I'm going to start in a kneeling position, and you should be able to draw a straight line all the way from my knees up to my head. So the first joint we're going to start with is the neck, and this is going to be really simple at first. I'm just going to do what's called flexion extension, or simply moving my chin all the way down to my chest and up to the ceiling. I want to make this movement as slow and deliberate as possible, and when I tuck my chin down, I'm thinking of touching my chin to my chest, and when I go all the way up, I'm thinking of slowly taking my chin up to the ceiling. Now we're moving on to some rotations. So I'm going to pull my chin back and slowly rotate on that axis and turn my chin one way and then the other. I want to make sure I'm really controlled while doing this, and I'm not holding my breath. I want to just breathe normally. Also watch for any shifts from side to side or any tension in your neck while doing this. Okay, so now we're going to knit this all together and do a full neck CAR. So what I want to think about when doing this is I'm thinking of drawing the biggest possible circle with my chin while keeping the rest of my body stable. So I'm going to start by tucking my chin down to my chest, slowly rotating out to the side, and slowly turning that chin up to the ceiling. And I'm breathing through all this, that's really important. And I'm going to finish up that rotation all the way back. Now I'm just turning to the front so you guys can kind of get a better view of what's going on. So I tuck that chin down, slowly rotate to the right. I side bend to the right, turn my chin up to the ceiling, start rotating to the left, side bend to the left, and finish up in that chin tucked position. And I'm just going to repeat this nice and slow on the other side. So we're moving down from the neck now to the spine, and this is going to be a simple cat camel. Now I've often seen this butchered where people just go through it really rapidly, don't really know what they're moving. I want you to think about going through this as slowly as possible. So as you can see, I'm starting with my back in a completely arched position, all the way from my tailbone up to the base of my head. And I want to slowly start one vertebrae at a time, rounding my back, all the way from the base of my neck, all the way up to the tailbone. And I'm going to get a big inhale and exhale here. Now once I've done that, you can see I'm slowly starting to arch my back, starting at that tailbone, moving up in a wave all the way up to the base of my neck. So I'm starting in my first position again. And I'm going to go through that whole sequence once more, remembering to take a full inhale and exhale in the finish position. Again, make sure your breathing is controlled on this, and you want to think about moving one vertebral segment at a time. Okay, so now that's done, I'm going to move on to my spine cars. So think about this just like the neck. I'm trying to get some rotation at my back as well. So I'm going to set up in a kneeling position, but with my butt on my heels this time. I'm going to start just like the neck by tucking my chest all the way down to my knees. When I reach my limit, I'm going to start turning to the right. I'm going to side bend to the right and slowly take my chest up to the ceiling. And I'm then going to rotate to the left, side bend to the left, and come back down all the way. And I'm obviously going to repeat this on the other side. So go through that same series of movements. Remember to keep your breathing constant. And you want to make sure you're not shifting your hips one way or the other. You want to kind of get a better view of that here. So when I shift out to face the camera, I want to make sure my hips stay square, especially as I rotate and side bend. You'll kind of see now that my hips want to move a little bit. I want to control that as much as possible. So I'm just going through 2 slow controlled reps in each direction. So we're working our way out from the center to the periphery, and we're going to do some cars for the shoulder now. Now this is for your ball and socket joint. So I want you to really focus on this one because it can be really hard if you've never done it before. You want to think about moving only from that shoulder and nowhere else. You'll find that your torso will want to twist, rotate, your neck will want to get involved, all kinds of things will want to happen. So really take a second, make sure you're aware of where your body is on this one. So I'm going to set up in a kneeling position, and if I'm going to start with my right hand, I'm going to get my left leg forward, and I'm just squeezing a ball in my right hand just for a little bit of extra tension. So I'm going to start by slowly drawing that elbow all the way up to my ear. I'm going to pause here for a second and slowly start rotating out. All the while, if you notice, I'm turning my palm outwards. So I'm going to finish up with my little finger all the way out in front. And I'm going to reverse that motion. Slowly take my hand back and start rotating out until I finish with my elbow next to my ear, and I'm going to slowly bring it back down. I'm just going to shift to face you so you can get a better view of what's going on. I want you to take note of my torso position on this. I'm trying really hard not to rotate towards that ball. There's a little bit of movement going on, but I'm doing my best to control it. Especially when I go back, I want to make sure I'm not turning towards that ball. I'm trying to keep my chest square to the wall in front of me. Now I'm going to go through that same sequence on my left hand this time. And if you notice, I'm using my right hand to just block my other knee. And I'm just using this to create a little bit of extra tension. The more I press that right hand into my knee, the less likely I am to rotate with my torso. And I'm just going to be more likely to keep this movement as controlled as possible. You might hear some clicks and pops in your shoulder when you do this. That's absolutely fine. Again, as long as there's no pain accompanying the movement. And I'm just shifting to the front again. And while I'm doing this, I'm also thinking about that rotation coming from my shoulder itself. It's easy to turn from the wrist or the elbow and not from the shoulder. So make sure you feel like that ball is moving inside the socket. And slowly bringing it down for that last rep. So the next thing we're moving on to are the scapular cars. Now my scapulae or my shoulder blades are those triangular shaped bones on my upper back. And these can be really hard if you've never done them. So I'd recommend you video yourself or maybe just use a mirror, especially the first few times you do these, just to make sure you're getting motion where you actually want it. So I'm going to set up on my knees for this one. Stick my hands out at about 45 degrees and make fists. And I'm going to start by reaching my shoulders out away from each other, reaching up for the ceiling, slowly pulling them back and then pulling them all the way down. And then I'm going to reverse that. So I'm going to start by shrugging, reaching out, pulling them down, and then retracting them together. So I'm just going to turn around to the front so you can get a better view. So as you can see, I'm going to start by making space between my shoulder blades. I'm shrugging them up all the way up to my ears, slowly pulling them back while still maintaining that shrug, and then peeling them down towards my hips. And again, I'm going to reverse this. So shrug, reach out, slowly depress, and then retract them together again. Okay, we're moving on to the elbow now, and these are relatively simple, but I want you to make sure you're taking your time and doing them right. So when I'm doing my elbow cars, I want to think about squeezing every last bit of rotation out of my elbow and not just going through the motions. I'm going to start with my elbows by my sides, turn my palms up to the ceiling, and then actively turn them outwards as much as I can while I do a bicep curl. When I reach the top of that curl, I'm going to turn my palms down and bring them all the way down. And I'm going to reverse that movement, this time keeping my palms facing down on the way up and turning them down when I bring them back down. So I'm just turning to the side so you can kind of see what's happening. So start with those palms out, slowly curl up as high as you can, and then I'm going to turn my palms down. Continue actively turning them down while I straighten my elbow out. Again, I'm going to reverse this. So palms facing down on the way up, palms facing up on the way down. So the last joint for our upper body is the wrist. And the wrist is a funny one because it's a joint that's supposed to be very mobile, but it is actually a little gritty and bound up for most folks because, they're texting all the time, they're on their laptop all the time. So they don't actually move their wrist through its fullest capable range of motion. And that's what we're going to try and do today. So I'm going to do these one wrist at a time, just to really hone in on what's going on. So I'm going to go left hand first, and I'm going to start by just peeling my palm down towards the floor. I'm going to slowly start turning out towards the thumb side. I'm going to pull my fingers up towards my face, slowly turn towards that little finger side and go all the way down. And then as you see, I'm just reversing that circle, going all the way out and around. So I'm back in my starting position. Just turning around to the front so you can see that rotation happening a little bit better. So turning my palm down, slowly turning towards the thumb side, pulling it all the way up, and then finishing that circle all the way around. Again, just like the shoulder, you might hear some clicks and pops at your wrist. As long as it's not pain and it's just a little bit of snapping, that's absolutely okay. And obviously I'm going to do my other side as well. My other hand is just supporting my wrist, supporting my forearm rather, to make sure that it doesn't contribute, because we don't want our elbow turning and making up for a lack of wrist movement. So I'm just trying to work only that wrist joint while the rest of my body stays stable. Okay, so now we're moving on to the lower body and we're going to start with the hips. Now your hips are basically a ball and socket joint just like the shoulder. They should technically be capable of almost as much motion as the shoulder, but for most of us they're super gritty, tight, and they just don't move very well. So I want you to really take your time with this and watch how I do them and hopefully try and imitate it the best you can. I'm going to take a ball, pin it behind my knee, and that's just to make sure the rotation only occurs at the hips and not at the knee. So I'm going to start on all fours, just like the cat-camel kind of position. I want to make sure I start in a fairly neutral spine position, so you can see I'm arching and rounding my back and kind of finding the midway neutral point between the two. I'm visualizing drawing a big circle with my right knee. So I'm starting by pulling that knee up to my chest, drawing it out to the side, and slowly turning that heel up to the ceiling until I finish up with my knee by my side. And I'm going to reverse it, so taking that heel up to the ceiling, drawing it out to the side, and then pulling it all the way back. Now this is going to be important. I want you to really hone in on what's happening from the front. Now when I move from my right side, I want to make sure I'm not tilting with my left side of my body. So my left elbow is still pressing strong through the ground. I'm trying not to move my pelvis. So everything is stiff as a statue. The only thing that's hopefully moving is my hip. So I'm obviously going to do both sides. So I'm just shifting it out to the left hip. Again, these can be really hard, and it's not unusual to feel some cramping at your hip. If that does happen, just take a second, shake it off, get some deep breaths, and try and continue. You might want to make your circle a little bit smaller and less ambitious. just to make sure that cramp doesn't spoil your warm-up. Also notice when I do these that I'm not getting much motion at my back, because again, I'm just trying to mobilize the hips. I'm not trying to move my spine this time. So I want my back to be as stable as possible with only my hips doing all the movement. Okay, so we're almost done here. I'm moving on to my knees next. But before I go on to the full knee guard, I'm starting with something called a tibial rotation. So what I'm trying to do here is, once I've planted my heel on the ground, I want to think about rotating my tibia, my shin bone, out one way and then the other. Now, if you've never done this before, it's a really hard movement, and don't be surprised if you only get maybe 5-10 degrees of motion, if that. But I want you to feel like the motion is actually happening at your shin and not at your ankle. So once I go through about 4 of those and establish that rotation, I'm going to go and move on to my full knee cars. So I'm going to hook my hand underneath my thigh and lift that ankle up off the ground. And I'm going to start by turning my shin out to the outside, straightening my knee out, rotating internally, and then peeling it all the way back. Now I'm staying rotated internally while I straighten my knee out, turn out, and then come all the way back in. So this will make more sense when you kind of see from the other angle, but I'm just thinking about maximizing motion at that knee while minimizing it from everywhere else. Hence the arm hooked under my leg. So as you can see, I don't straighten my knee out all the way, but that's about as much as my mobility will allow. So if you can do more, then go for it. Now, obviously, I want to make sure I'm doing both sides. So again, I'm not doing it, but make sure you do the rotations on that right side first before moving on to the actual full knee car. Okay, we're almost done here. And the last thing I'm going to do is the ankle car. Now it's a similar setup to the tibial rotations. So I'm going to start by gas pedaling my foot down towards the ground, turning out towards that little toe side, peeling it up all the way, turning towards that big toe side, and then gas pedaling back down. And I want to kind of stay on that big toe side, peel it up, rotate out to the little toe, and gas pedal back down. So again, I'm thinking of drawing a big circle with those toes here and making sure I cover both sides. Now this is where you want to make sure that your shin doesn't rotate and try and compensate. And I'm kind of keeping my fingers on my shin bone for that reason. I want to make sure that motion is only coming from my ankle and nowhere else. Okay, and that's our warm-up done. Now this warm-up can be done as a standalone routine on its own, and I highly recommend that you do at least once a day, just as a basic way of making sure all your joints are in good working condition. Now the second part of this video is going to be me taking you through some slightly more active movements, just to test all the range of motion that we've got from our warm-up, and just to see how it all holds up when we knit it into more complex patterns. Okay, so the next thing we're going to move on to is called a hip flexion passive range hold. And hip flexion is nothing but my ability to pull my knee up to my chest. And a passive range hold, which I'm going to walk you through now, is basically a way for me to test if the range of motion I have is active or passive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by pulling my knee up to my chest with the assistance of my hands. And when I kind of reach my limit, I'm going to slowly let my hands go and fight to actively keep my knee up at the same position. So once I hold that for about 5 seconds, I'm going to get my hands back on and try and pull my knee up a little bit higher, maybe a couple of millimeters. Now, do note that this should actually be hard once you let your hands go, and if you don't feel anything or if it's too easy, then you're not being active enough. So I want you to think about, once you let your hands go, driving your knee up towards your face actively. If you do this right, you might feel the muscles on the right side of your core really working hard to keep you up there. So I'm just going to go through about 4 of these, trying to pull myself a little bit higher each time. And again, I'm holding it for about 4 to 6 seconds. That's about really all I can manage. And I'm going to go through that same sequence on my other side. A useful little tip here is to think about drawing your abs in, pulling your belly button in while doing these. It's just going to help you engage your abs a little bit more and use them to kind of help you keep your hip up in the air. If you look at my hip position on this, it's not too dissimilar to a squat. If you were to just rotate me about 90 degrees, I would basically be in a really good squat position, and that's what I'm trying to work on. The ability for me to get into that good deep hip flexion and actively use my core muscles while I'm in that position. As I finish up these last couple of reps, I'm just trying to squeeze every last inch of motion that I can out of that hip. Okay, so my next move is called a knee hinge, and I'm going to use that lacrosse ball over there. Just pin it up on the crease of my hip, and I'm going to actively pull my hip up and try and trap that ball there. So once I'm in that position, as you can see, I'm just straightening my knee out while really fighting to keep that knee high up towards my chest. You can see that I do lose that position slightly, but I'm fighting really hard to keep it up. I just cramped a little bit there, so I'm just resetting. So now when I'm ready to go, I'm actively trying to straighten my knee while still driving my knee up towards my face. You might feel this in your hamstring, or you might even feel it in your hip flexor. That's just the front of your hip, or even your abs. That's where I was feeling it. So I'm going to go through both sides. And whenever you're doing unilateral movements, I want you to keep an eye on any differences between the left and right. None of us are symmetrical, and we usually do have a bad side. So I want you to really focus on how your body feels and any left-right difference that you might have. Okay, so now we're going to move up to a seated position and get into what's called a 90-90 position. So it's pretty simple. I want a 90-degree angle at both knees, and I basically want my front shin parallel to my back thigh and my front thigh parallel to my back shin. So you can kind of see I'm in a pretty good 90. And what I'm aiming to do from here is stretch out both my hips. So I'm going to start with that front right leg. And what I'm trying to do is actively arch my back, pull my chest up, and hover my chest over my knee. So I should feel the stretch deep in my right glute. So I'm just holding that stretch, getting about 5 deep breaths in that position. I want to make sure I'm pulling my abs in as I breathe, and when I exhale, I'm trying to slowly pull myself deeper into that stretch. So once I kind of finish 5, I'm going to move on to that back hip. I'm just shifting a little bit so you can see what's going on. I have my hands behind me for support. This is just to make sure I actually get that rotation at the hip, and I want to feel this stretch in my left hip or the trail leg. So you probably can't see this, but I'm actively trying to get my sit bone to touch the ground, and I should be feeling that stretch somewhere on the underside of that left hip. It should feel like quite a deep stretch and not on the outside of the leg. You're stretching into what's called hip internal rotation, and most people are going to be really, really tight here. So I want you to take your time with this and really try and get that hip bone to touch the ground. So I obviously want to make sure I do both sides. So I'm just shifting, making sure I align myself into those good 90-degree angles again. And I'm going to start with that left leg this time, stretching into external rotation. So you can see I'm just tapping my chest to remind myself to arch my back, and I'm going to hover my chest over my knee and try and find that stretch. Now you want to shift around a little bit so you really find that stretch, since different people feel it in different places. Start in the region of your knee, but you can turn your chest one way and the other just to really find that optimum point where you feel the most tension. So just another note on breathing for this. I want to make sure my inhales and exhales are as slow and deep as possible. and I'm not holding my breath. And if you ever do feel like you're going to cramp, just back out of that position a little bit. So if I felt like I was going to cramp in this position, I would just move my hands further back away from my feet, so I'll get into a slightly less aggressive stretch. Again, I'm stretching that back hip into internal rotation, trying to keep my chest up while touching that sit bone down to the ground. I'm just getting those last few breaths in, and I think this is my tight side, so I'm just making sure I spend a little bit of extra time just stretching it out, making sure I'm controlling my breathing as much as possible. Okay, so as we finish up with this passive stretch, we're going to slowly take into a couple more dynamic movements just to kind of test my hips and see how they feel. So I'm going to do something called a bear sit transition. Now, I'm going to basically start in my L sit, my 90-degree angles, and I'm going to keep my hands behind me. So I'm opening up my trail leg while actively driving my right leg into the ground. So I'm going to open it up as much as I can until I reach a roadblock. And when I do, I'm going to bring my right leg along. And again, pause here in this position for a second while I actively pull my trail leg down to the ground and then bring my first leg all the way through. Now these should be pretty hard, so I want to make sure you're doing them right. I'm just going to walk you through a couple of the cues. First thing, my chest is always up. That's why my hands are behind me. It gives me a little bit of support. I don't want to round my back on this since that compromises the movement at my hips. Second thing, I'm trying to keep the distance between my knees as much as possible. So as you can see, as I go through these, I get a little bit more warmed up. I can get a little bit more distance going between them. Another useful thing to think about is when you're opening that trail leg up, to actively press the other leg down into the floor. If I do this right, I'll feel a big stretch at my groin, and same thing here. So I'm actively peeling that right knee towards the other wall while I drive my left leg down towards the ground. You can see I'm getting a little bit more range now. So my goal with these should be to always push myself a little bit more each rep. You don't want to get too comfortable, and you don't want rep 4 to feel a lot easier than rep 1. It should still be hard and challenging. You should hopefully be able to get a few more millimeters of motion out of your hips though. That's all I'm going for. I'm just shifting around a little bit so you can get a slightly better view of my back position on this. As you can see, I'm trying really hard to keep the chest up. I don't want to let my chest fold down and my upper back to round. Now it's okay to shift your hands a little bit just to make sure you're getting your hips into a good position. The goal of these is to really open up my hips, so I'm not really too fussy about what happens with my hands here. I just want them to give me a good solid base to go through these movements. Okay, and we're almost done here. We're just going to finish up with one final really hard active movement to kind of knit all that we've done together so far. This is just a simple body weight squat, but it's what I'm going to call an active squat. So I'm not just dropping down into that squat position. I'm actively trying to create as much tension as possible and pull myself down into that squat. And once I'm at the bottom, I'm going to hold for a second and actively push myself back up. So I'm not going really fast through this motion. So the real key to this is tension, and the more tension you can get, the better that squat is going to feel. So I'm thinking firstly of squeezing the life out of that roller between my hands. I'm thinking about screwing my feet into the floor. I'm thinking of sucking my belly in, pulling those abs in tight. And finally, I'm actively thinking about my hips opening up, making space for me to descend down into that squat. Again, this should not feel easy. This is really, really hard, high tension squatting. If you've ever done a heavy barbell squat before, this should feel similar. You're going to be shooting for about 4 to 6 really good quality, high tension reps. And you'll know you're doing it right when you really pray for that set to end, like I was here. Okay, if you've made it this far, thank you for listening. I hope it was really useful, and we'll hopefully have many more videos in this series very shortly. Thanks.